1/3 of Americans believe Biden won because of voter fraud. What I have in front of me is an article from The Hill that details the following. Roughly 1/3 of Americans believe that President Biden's 2020 electoral victory was the result of widespread voter fraud, according to a new Monmouth University poll. 32% of respondents say fraud was the reason Biden won the presidential election, maintaining a trend that has taken hold over the past 7 months. In similar polls conducted in November, January, March, the number of voters who believe that fraud cost former President Trump a second term in the White House has remained steady at 32%. The polling underscores how pervasive Trump's false claims of stolen election have among his supporters in the months since the 2020 presidential race. The continuing efforts to question the validity of last year's election is deepening the partisan divide in ways that could have long-term consequences for our democracy, even if Americans don't quite see it that way yet. That's a statement from Patrick Murray, the director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute. The majority of those who believe that voter fraud delivered the White House to Biden identify as either Republican or Republican-leaning, according to the poll. 63% of GOP voters and Republican-leaning voters say that Biden was not legitimately elected president. At the same time, 14% of those surveyed say that they will never accept Biden as the legitimate president, including roughly 3 in 10 Republican and Republican-leaning voters. The number of those who believe Biden's victory was due to fraud is also similar to the 33% who believe that efforts by state legislators to audit the results of the 2020 election are legitimate, according to the poll. Now, to summarize all this in a nutshell, this is essentially the evidence that the propaganda worked, that all of the rhetoric from Trump and his goons and everybody else that associates themselves with that man have been preaching for the past several months that the election was stolen, it was rigged, he was robbed, all this other nonsense and jargon. This proves, and other polls like it that details the same information, prove that the propaganda was successful. And people have been successfully hoodwinked into believing that a presidential election was genuinely stolen. And not only stolen from anybody, stolen from Donald Trump, of all people. You know, we were actually warned of what would occur before the election actually took place. It was something that they called the Red Mirage, I think it was. I think it was the Red Mirage because of the coronavirus. There were a lot of mail-in votes. It was a huge volume of mail-in voting. And that's honestly like where the heart of the problem lies, that the Republicans had the problem with, was the mail-in voting. It was wrong. You know, dead people were voting. You know the whole nonsense. I don't need to rehash it. But they count the in-person votes first. And once, they let the mail-in votes come in, and then they count those. So what the Red Mirage prepped us for was it's going to make it seem like Trump is winning, but once the mail-in votes get there and they finish counting those up and tallying those votes, Biden will be the true winner of the election. Of course, people don't look for information. People don't look for the truth in a lot of scenarios, so they just run with whatever the news is saying. And by the news, I mean One American News Network, Newsmax, and other networks such as Fox to a certain extent. Although you can't put too much blame on Fox because they actually bent the knee when they saw that Trump was losing the election. They weren't like the other networks that went off the deep end. But people were fooled. And a lot of people still are fooled. And it's sad to say this, but a lot of people are never, although, how small of a percentage it may be, a lot of people are never going to believe that Joe Biden actually fairly won the election, even with all the evidence that's been presented. How many times did they go to court? What, over 40, 50 times? How many cases did they win? None. Actually, I think they won one case, but it was on like some procedural nonsense. So none of the court cases had an effect on how the election ultimately turned out. Dead people were not, in fact, voting. It wasn't rigged, okay? Everything that they've been saying this entire time isn't true. And what they're doing now in these Republican-led states is they're going across and they're cracking down on voting rights. There's this huge conversation at the moment that we're having about the For the People Act, which is legislation that is centered towards bolstering the vote, essentially, and cracking down on dark money, voter ID, all that nonsense. They're handling that with the For the People Act. Okay, I went into detail about the For the People Act in a separate video if you want to take a look at that. But there's been a lot of talk about For the People Act. And if you've noticed, all these Republicans, all these people that have been raving about how the election was rigged and voting is messed up, they're completely silent on the For the People Act. In fact, they don't even want to have a debate about it. They don't want to talk about it. Okay? It's all a farce. It's all smoke and mirrors. They don't actually believe in getting more people to vote, because what every Republican knows, and trust me, they know this, is that the bigger the turnout, the more likely whatever election it is to swing Democrat. They know that for a fact, which is why they want to crack down and not have a lot of people vote. If you look at the voting laws passed in, say, Florida or Georgia or anywhere else that they're doing this nonsense, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. They're cracking down on mail-in voting. Like I said, that was a big thing they had a problem with. And they're just making it to where democracy is less likely to prevail. And it's insanely scary. And a lot of people aren't really picking up on it yet. I even know I've seen individuals that I would say are, competent individuals that have even fallen for this fraudulent election nonsense. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's one of those situations where when you say something in enough amount of times, people start to believe it, even if it's a lie. If you say it and you keep repeating it and you keep harping on it, and if you insist it, people will be like, maybe he has a point. But the whole thing with this is that there is no point. Joe Biden won the election. He won it fair and square. There was no cheating. There was no underhanded tactics. I mean, there's evidence of this. They went to court. They did the whole thing. Donald Trump lost the election. But yet, here we are with 1/3 of the country believing that he didn't. And we have these Republican-led states that are passing these restrictive voting laws, which is what they are. I remember when the one law was brought up in Georgia and the corporations came out against it, like in a statement. They said, well, yeah, we don't really agree with that. And that's really all they had to say about it. And Mitch McConnell came out and said, oh, corporations should stay out of politics. The same people that fund your political campaigns, those are the people that, I mean, he's taking money from every corporation, every big business, every CEO you can think of, right? But they should stay out of politics. Honestly, at this point, anybody that still believes that Donald Trump actually won the election is ridiculous. But I think this kind of shows what percentage of the country is just gone off the deep end. I mean, I think that this percent we can kind of write off, because I've always been of the mindset that if you're a progressive, you're a Democrat, a person that wants to see change, there's other people on the other side of the aisle that may be Republican or Libertarian or whatever their identity may be, and you can, spit whatever you need to them, and you can bring them to your side. But there are those that no matter what, you can't get. And that it's around 30 or so percent that we might not be able to get. But there's a clean 10 to 15, maybe even 20 if I'm being optimistic, percent of people on the other side of the aisle that I think that we can get, and we can get to align with our agenda. We just have to try hard enough and make our arguments convincing enough so that we can prevail. But this is sad news, man. 1/3 of the country. It's quite a bit of people.